Welcome to the first UFM Lou Douglas Lecture of this school year. I'm Marcia Horning, a board member at UFM Community Learning Center and member of the Lou Douglas Lecture Series Steering Committee. The Lou Douglas Lecture Series on public issues was founded to honor the memory of Lou Douglas, a distinguished professor of political science at Kansas State University from 1949 until 1977, who was widely known for his power to inspire students, faculty, and citizens to instigate change and to motivate grassroots organizations and individuals to pursue social justice in politics, economics, and foreign policy. The series reaches not only the university community, but also the citizens of Manhattan and the region. The focus is consistent with the intent of the land-grant emphasis of Kansas State University. So following the lecture, we'll have a question and answer period, and we would just ask that if you have a question to come up to one of these two microphones right here on the sides, and so we can hear you. And also, if you need to leave when the lecture is over, or if you need to step out to use the restroom, we would ask that you use the door on the back side of the room. And I also wanted to ask everyone to silence your cell phones, if you would. And I wanted to let you know that this lecture is supported by the Provost Distinguished Lecture Fund. So with that, I would like to introduce Jim Kaup. He's an attorney and Lou Douglas Lecture Series Steering Committee member and a former student of Lou Douglas's. So he will introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening. I think right off the bat, I would ask you to stand if you can for just a moment of silence for the victims of the shooting in Oregon at the community college last week. Thank you. I asked Linda Tiener, who can't be here tonight, she's executive director at UFM. I'm sure many of you know her. I asked her if I could have the privilege tonight of doing what she usually does at the lecture series, saying a few words about the lecture series and about the man that it honors. And I am very appreciative of Linda's indulging me, and I will try not to greatly abuse the privilege before introducing tonight's speaker. But I believe it is important for you to know that this lecture series is not named for someone who graduated and went out and made a lot of money and gave some back to the school. Okay? Not that there's anything wrong with that, certainly. But this lecture series recognizes and honors a teacher. And it happens to be a teacher who had great ability and great character. As Marcia said, I was a student of Professor Douglas, and I was also one of his research assistants, not a particularly good one. This was all back in the early and mid-1970s, which was the previous millennium. Okay? And as long as I can remember, I have had a lot of respect and admiration for educators, for teachers. And I will tell you that those feelings were never stronger for me than the time that I spent here at K-State. And they were never stronger at K-State than the times when I sat in one of Professor Douglas's classrooms. You have some information on the program and about the lecture series and the words that Marcia said, but let me add a couple that are off the website for the Lou Douglas Lecture Series. Lou inspired students and faculty and others to bring about changes that would benefit the disenfranchised, the oppressed, the excluded, the poor. He inspired people to pursue social and economic justice, civil rights, voting rights, and peace. He represented the highest standards of public morality and elicited our best impulses as citizens to strengthen democracy. Professor Douglas was an early and strong supporter of the University for Man. And UFM, to its great credit, has honored Professor Douglas by establishing this lecture series, and in doing so has brought to this campus dozens of distinguished speakers on public policy topics dealing with solving social, political, and economic problems. Professor Douglas was my teacher, my mentor, my friend. He was insightful, he was kind and humble, and he could, in fact, inspire you to try to do great things. And he was wise, which is not a term to be thrown around loosely. You're sitting here in a university, there are lots of smart people running around, right? Even some smart people in this room. But wise people are far less common, in my experience. Lou was wise. And my wish to each of you who are students at K-State is that somewhere along your academic road, you'll be as fortunate as I was to have a teacher who was as demanding, as inspiring, as honorable, and as wise as Professor Lewis Douglas. Professor Douglas had a great grasp of current events, both social and political movements. And over the years, I've often wondered how he would see his nation and his state if he were still alive. My fear is that he would think that my generation, and probably the one after mine, before yours, for many of you, has done a pretty miserable job to advance the progressive causes for which he worked so tirelessly. For example, he would be saddened that we live in a near constant state of war, saddened that inequality of wealth has increased dramatically and dangerously, saddened that racial prejudice is still with us. And then there is Kansas. Professor Douglas would, I believe, be troubled by the recent transformation of this state. But he would have understood the forces that moved us away from our state's progressive heritage. Which brings us to our speaker tonight, who is probably best known, at least here in Kansas, for his 2004 book, What's the Matter with Kansas? That book's analysis of Kansas politics and culture, I believe, would be seen by Professor Douglas as solid scholarship, which he most likely would have wished were a work of fiction, some fantasy concocted by a bright yet twisted mind. And I think Professor Douglas would have enjoyed and admired all of Thomas Frank's writings because of his insight into politics, culture, and governance. Thomas Frank grew up in Johnson County, attended Shawnee Mission East High School, the University of Kansas, University of Virginia, and received a PhD in history from the University of Chicago. He is a prolific writer, and he's authored many, many essays and articles, including many, many articles for Harper's Magazine and the Wall Street Journal, among others. Among his more recent works were books The Wrecking Crew and Pity the Billionaire. My favorite tribute to Thomas Frank comes from the author Barbara Ehrenreich, who wrote, quote, "What's the Matter with Kansas is the most insightful analysis of American right-wing pseudo-populism to come along in the last decade. As for Kansas, you've got to love a state that could produce someone as wickedly funny, compassionate, and nonstop brilliant as Tom Frank." So, please welcome Thomas Frank.
Well, thank you all for coming out. So Barbara Ehrenreich is one of my best friends. That's why she said that stuff. I saw her on an airplane the other day. She was, well, it doesn't matter. I won't tell you that story. I'll tell you that story some other time. So, of course, I want to talk about politics tonight, and I want to talk about politics of the last 7 years, since 2008, which is really, I think, we're going to, I didn't even sip from the, come on, I think we're going to, for the rest of our lives, look back at the financial crisis and the bailouts, 2008 and 2009, as the most important event in our, most important economic event anyway in our lifetimes, and probably in the century. unless, of course, it gets trumped by something even worse a little ways down the line, which it might, could easily happen. So I'm here to talk about the political scene in this country since then. And it's been, think about it, of what's happened since 2008. And it's been a time when people across the country rose up boldly against imaginary threats and rallied to economic theories that they understood only in the gauziest terms. It's a country where fears of a takeover by left-wing radicals became epidemic, even though radicals themselves had pretty much disappeared. I always think of that. Remember that billboard by Junction City? Do you remember that? It had Obama's face. What did it say? It was like, it called him a Marxist or something like this. Yeah, Marxist dictator. I love that. I mean, I love it in the sense that it gives me something to write about. But this is a country where ideological nightmares, of the sort of Glenn Beck variety, came to seem more vivid and more compelling than what was actually on the front page of the newspaper. So it's kind of a crazy time, but you think about it in a different way, and it's also a miraculous time. It's like we're going through a revival crusade in which the gospel is the old-time religion of the free market. It's been an era of grassroots rebellion and, frankly, the incredible recovery of the conservative movement from the depths of defeat. If you remember back what it looked like in 2008 when George Bush was president, Tom DeLay, well, he was gone by then, but the Tom DeLay, Jack Abramoff era. And there is something miraculous about all this, okay? Think about it this way. It has been 34 years since the supply-side revolution first conquered Washington. 1981. I was, a junior in high school? No, I was a sophomore in high school, Shawnee Mission East. 1981, the supply-side revolution conquered Washington, and since then the free market faith has become the dogma of the nation's ruling class, shared by lots of Democrats as well as by Republicans. And since then we have had decades, 4 decades now, 3 decades of deregulation, de-unionization, privatization, and free trade agreements. They just signed one today, I saw in the paper. I mean, the free market ideal in these last 34 years, the free market ideal has been projected into every corner of the nation's life. American universities try to put themselves on a market-based footing these days. So do hospitals, electric utilities, museums. So does the post office. So does the CIA. So does the U.S. Army. And now, after all of this has been going on for decades, we, have a people's uprising, a Tea Party movement that goes burning through the country demanding that we embrace the free market ideology after we've been doing this for 34 years. And this happens, of course, only a very short time after that very same ideology led the world into the greatest economic catastrophe that most of us will ever see in our lifetimes. I mean, this is an amazing moment. Amazing is a good word for it. Unlikely is also a good word for it. I think preposterous is the best word, though. But I want to give the rebels that I'm describing, I want to give them their due. I want to acknowledge that the conservative comeback of the last few years is something unique in the history of American social movements. And I'm sure you all are studying American social movements, so this is what I mean when I say that. This is a very unusual time that we're living in. Think about it. You've got a mass conversion to free market theory as a response to hard times. I've never heard of that happening before in this country or any other. I mean, before the latest economic slump, this slump that never seems to end, before this slump, I had never heard of a recession's victims developing a wholesale taste for Chicago school economic theory or a spontaneous hostility to the works of Franklin Roosevelt. Before this last recession, people who had been cheated by bankers almost never took that opportunity to demand that bankers be freed from red tape and the scrutiny of the law. Before 2009, the man in the breadline did not ordinarily weep for the man lounging on his yacht. Now, the achievement of this thing is even more remarkable when you remember what things were like in 2008. Remember, after the disasters of the George W. Bush presidency, and you had a whole series of them, scandals, lousy wars, all of this sort of thing, and then it culminated in Hurricane Katrina, and then it culminated in this colossal failure on Wall Street. And after this happened, all the citizens of East Coast Consensus Land, which is where I live nowadays, but they all came together and they agreed on the way in which the nation was traveling. They all knew the direction that history was going to take. They'd seen this movie before, and they knew how the plot was supposed to unfold. The plates were shifting, they said. Conservatism's reign was at an end. A new era of liberal activism was supposed to be at hand. And this was obvious to them. This was the mandate of history. And it was as plain as those enormous crowds that used to turn out to see Barack Obama on the campaign trail. Now, the pundits back in Washington had a very predictable script for the Republican Party as well. And they knew what had to happen there. They said the Republican Party had to become moderate, or it would face a long period of irrelevance. So what the sort of polite thinking world of the East Coast expected from the leaders of the right back in 2008 was repentance. They wanted to hear these guys say they were sorry, right? They assumed that conservatives would be embarrassed by what had, all the disasters that had befallen their leaders in the preceding few years. They thought that Republicans would confess their errors and make haste for the political center. So the world expected contrition from these guys. And what the world got, of course, was the opposite, delivered on the point of a bayonet. Instead of complying with the new speed limit, the strategic thinkers of the right hit the gas. Instead of seeking accommodation, they went on a quest for ideological purity. And instead of elevating their remaining centrists into positions of power, they purged those guys. And you know that story here in Kansas. It was quite spectacular the way they did it here. And instead of acknowledging that they had enjoyed 30 years behind the steering wheel of the government, they declared that they had never really got their turn in the first place. The true believers, George W. Bush wasn't a real conservative at all, they would say. I'm sure people still do say that. The true believers had never really been in charge. All the journalistic and historical work about the conservative movement and its rise to power and all that, it was all just so much, propaganda. And therefore, the disastrous events of the Bush administration cast no discredit on conservative ideas themselves. So the solution, they thought, wasn't to reconsider, let's say, bank deregulation, one of the great conservative causes of the last 30 years. The solution is not to reconsider bank deregulation. It's to double down on it, to work even more energetically for the laissez-faire utopia that's out there somewhere. Now, pure idealism like this is very rare in American history. It's pretty unusual. And the sort of jaded men of the press sat back and waited for the conservative movement to fall apart and for the system to somehow punish these guys for being too extreme or something. And they waited for the pull of the center to work its mechanical magic. But the gods didn't intervene that way this time around. In 2010, a radicalized Republican Party scored its greatest victory in congressional elections in many decades. They took 600 seats from Democrats in state-level elections. They purged countless moderates from the Senate and the House of Representatives, and last year completed their reconquista of Congress. And we're just having a new chapter of that right now, unfold before our very eyes right now with Speaker Boehner. By the way, do you like this? Is my homage to Boehner, this tie. He wears these very, these beautiful pastel-colored ties. Anyhow, he's gone now. And it's going to be very interesting to see who replaces him. But look, I'm trying to emphasize how peculiar all this is in terms of the broad sweep of American history. The social patterns of hard times are supposed to be a simple thing. It's supposed to be almost mechanical. When the stock market collapses, the factories get closed, we know what's going to happen next. The markets disintegrate, the layoffs go up, the foreclosures begin, and before you know it, the people are out in the streets screaming for blood. This is just what happens, right? It's supposed to be a pattern. The people go out and demand the government do something about it, that they punish the perpetrators, that they rescue the victims. The people go out and demand insurance against further catastrophe. They demand further, stricter supervision of the economy to make sure it never happens again, that sort of thing. And the reason we think that's the pattern is because that's what happened last time around. That's what happened in the 1930s. When the catastrophe comes, we learned in the Great Depression, certain kinds of legislative deeds will follow automatically, right? You'll have unemployment insurance, and it'll be renewed and renewed again. And there'll be massive investment in public works. They'll name commissions to figure out what caused the crisis. They'll set up agencies to keep people from losing their houses to foreclosure. So as the economy falls apart, the assumption goes, Americans will also, and this one's kind of interesting, rediscover a certain sort of neighborliness. Do you know what I mean by this? They'll discover a sense of community and even a kind of collectivism that comes from sharing hard times together. This is, again, the classic story of the 1930s. People hurt by the downturn will start to take action by themselves without waiting for government. You'll see a wave of union organizing and a wave of strikes even, as everybody gives up on the promise of capitalism. Of course, people will protest. They'll go out and voice their discontent in public places. By the way, this kind of thing used to happen in Kansas all the time. I mean, you look at the 1890s in this state, which 1890s were unbelievably hard times, sort of off the scale for us today. And this state basically rose up in rebellion. It happened again in the 30s. We'll talk about that later. Doc Brinkley. We'll tell some funny stories about that. But my favorite story from this area in the 1930s actually came not from Kansas, but from Iowa, where you had a basically a farmers union. It was called the Farm Holiday Association, and they went on strike in 32. And they would surround the cities in Iowa and also in, Minnesota and a couple of other places. They would surround the cities, and when farmers would try to bring their produce to market, they would stop their trucks and climb up and throw everything overboard. And this is very, obviously, very dramatic. And so newspaper people from the East came out and were interviewing these guys, and they'd say, what makes you think it's okay to do this? And the farmers would say, we know it's okay because our ancestors did this at the Boston Tea Party. And what we're doing is exactly the same as that. And in 2008 and 2009, it looked like this exact pattern looked like it was going to repeat itself at first. The slump began with financial doings that were exactly the same as they had been in the 1920s. And then, just like in the awful days of 1932, average citizens all over the country rose up in outrage, fuming against the money men who had driven the country into the ditch, and the politicians who had stuck by their cronies while the rest of us lost everything. And 30s-style populism made a triumphant return, always, how they talked, always juxtaposing, average Americans against an uncaring and predatory world. All of this stuff came back. But when you heard somebody doing an homage to the Boston Tea Party in 2009 or 2010, the demands that they would be making, were always exactly the opposite of what those Iowa farmers used to say back in 1932. I mean, what makes the rebels' blood boil nowadays is not, the plight of their indebted neighbor. the guy down the road who's going to lose his farm. They don't really care about that these days. It's the possibility. What gets them angry is the possibility that such losers might escape their predicament, that government might step in and do exactly the things that those Iowa farmers wanted it to do 80 years ago. That 7 lean years has to follow 7 fat years seems like a fair deal to us nowadays. What burns our modern day populists is that anyone has the arrogance to think that human affairs might be arranged in any other way, that government might somehow allow our neighbor to evade his part of the common disaster, that some, mortgage remediation bill might let him out of the hard times that he so clearly deserves. The people moved to protest today are all what Herbert Hoover used to call liquidationists, and what they want the world to understand, to quote one of the protest signs I saw at the very first Tea Party rally in 2009, what they want the world to understand is that your mortgage is not my problem. So that's the culture of the hard times that we're going through right now. Now, this is an amazing reversal by almost any measure. How did conservatism pull this off? It's an amazing achievement in some ways. It's kind of an awful achievement. But politically speaking, it's very impressive. How'd they do it? Well, for one thing, by learning the lessons of the Great Depression. And by that I don't mean, about setting up the WPA or something like that. What I mean is that they understood that during times of economic collapse, nobody loves a defender of orthodoxy or, a self-appointed spokesman for our rightful rulers. Suddenly people like that are very deeply out of fashion. And so when the economic collapse of 2008 and 2009 came along, conservatism immediately positioned itself as a protest movement for hard times, as a social uprising with all of the sort of standard external signifiers that I've been talking about. People waving signs, people protesting banks, people protesting big corporations, people yelling through bullhorns, people organizing boycotts. Glenn Beck mimicked Martin Luther King's March on Washington. Rush Limbaugh had this book that he loved to talk about a couple of years ago. The book was called The Ruling Class. Okay? Great title. Paul Ryan, who was the Republican nominee for the vice presidency in 2012, wrote an article in Forbes magazine called Down with Big Business. This is Paul Ryan wrote that. The argument was that the struggle for a purified free market system was, as a matter of fact, a revolt against big money. That was his argument. I don't know. He believed it. Anyhow, and let me tell you about what I saw last November when I decided to come back here to Kansas to write about the elections. I mean, this was just a few months, 10 months ago now. But the midterm elections, Kansas was a battleground state for, I think, the first time in my entire life, The polls showed that the races were not just even. It looked like the Democrat was going to beat Sam Brownback for governor, and there was an independent who was going to beat Pat Roberts for the U.S. Senate. At least that's what the polls were saying. I mean, it didn't work out that way, of course. But I came back here. It was exciting. So I came back to watch what was going on, and I was staying at my dad's house in Johnson County, and the robocalls. You probably were here. Well, of course you were here. One after another. I mean, it's like an artillery barrage, right? Dozens of them every day, constantly calling us. And I would pick up the phone and listen to these. They're, quite fascinating. It's like the lowest level of political discourse, right? A robocall, right? A computer somewhere yelling in your ear. And from out of this kind of hailstorm of words, I picked out one phrase that really sort of struck me, and the phrase was Washington's liberal class. Okay? I like that phrase. Washington's liberal class. And it's delivered with the sort of sneering emphasis on the second word. Washington's liberal class. But the class is the key. Class is the key to understanding this whole confusing affair. You think about how ironic the results of the 2014 elections were. I mean, kind of crazy when you think about it. Georgia is the state in the U.S. with the highest unemployment rate. Just elected as its U.S. Senator a businessman who says he is proud of his career of outsourcing. The voters of Illinois overwhelmingly approved a referendum calling for a higher minimum wage, but they also, at the same time, chose as their governor this Wall Street type who in the past has said that the minimum wage ought to be reduced or eliminated. And the public as a whole, basically driven to fury by the spectacle of what's going on in D.C., by which I mean, the gridlock, this Congress that can't get anything done, just handed over the U.S. Senate to a party that has enshrined obstructionism as one of its, great articles of faith. The Newt Gingrich thing. I know I'm older than you. Newt Gingrich in the 90s, look it up. This was their thing. This was their strategy. It was very interesting. Okay, what explains this peculiar result? Now, the people talk all about this, and political scientists get on NPR and the pundits in the papers, and low turnout is one of the answers. Big money is a second one. If you have a lot of money, you can afford to do those robocalls, call my dad, 12 times a day and make him really, really angry. If you have a lot of money, you can do that. But I think the real reason that voters did these futile, clashing things is because this was our fourth hard times election in a row. I mean, lashing out blindly and in all directions against the powerful, against both low wages as well as against a comfortable liberal class that is amply represented in Washington. Lashing out against all of these people is still our default political position. 7 years now after the financial crisis and the bailouts. I mean, I saw a poll the other day. This is from 2014, from last year, September of last year. 70% of Americans think that the recession is still going. The recession actually ended in 2009. I mean, technically, in technical economic terms, 70% of Americans still think it's going on. They know that their region hasn't recovered. They know their household wealth is never coming back. And they know that people like them no longer have a shot at the kind of middle-class life that their parents led. It's off the table nowadays. So the point of the Tea Party movement, as I've said, is to attach this anger to the free market philosophy. And in doing this, in rescuing the free market philosophy after the free market philosophy had basically crashed the global economy, the Tea Party movement was very successful. I mean, they don't hold protests in parks anymore, but they're sort of species of cultural theft, appropriation, whatever you want to call it, what I've just been describing. This goes on, and it'll continue to go on until either economic conditions on the ground improve, which is not going to happen. I mean, this is permanent now, is my feeling. We'll talk about that later. Either until economic conditions improve, this is going to continue, or until the genuine owners of the populist tradition come back to take it away from them. And that's not going to happen either. Now, why am I so negative about all this? So I want to change subjects now and talk about the Democrats. When I say the rightful owners of the populist tradition, that's basically who, they owned it a long time ago. In the 1890s, it eventually, ask your professors about that. They owned it back then, they owned it in the 30s, they owned it right up until the 1960s. But how did our current ruling liberal class in Washington, the Democratic leadership faction, how did they deal with the eruption of the fake populist volcano all over America? Well, while the Republicans were out there all over America modeling themselves after Tom Paine, what Democratic strategists chose to embrace was the principle of dynastic succession. Rallying around the children of famous politicians. Did you notice this in the last go-around? All of these senatorial candidates who had famous last names, and of course, the woman that they're running for president now as well. I mean, their candidates also would rally around this form of post-partisanship that was so high-minded, so abstract, that they were so above it all that some of them, and these are Democrats, right? Some of them would even say that they wouldn't admit they had actually voted for the Democratic president, who is also, as it happens, a high-minded, post-partisan kind of guy. But they were so confident that big data and demographic change were going to bring this election home that they didn't even bother with persuasion, right? Who needs that? You don't have to persuade people anymore. It's all done with a computer and some robocalls, right? Democratic leaders chose to play the game this way, I think, because this is the way a certain species of Democrat always chooses to play the game. And they do it this way because, to a very surprising degree, they are actually what that robocall in Johnson County said they are. They are a class-based party. But the class in question is not you guys. Actually, it is you guys after you graduate, but it's the professional managerial class. It's not about workers. It's not about farmers, any of the people that the Democrats used to be identified with. It's about the professional managerial class. I mean, there's a reason that in Iowa they had the Democrats had a Senate candidate named Bruce Braley, and he thought it was a crushing put-down to describe another Iowa senator as a farmer from Iowa who never went to law school. And this is the same reason that, to quote a Newsweek headline, this is the same reason that working-class white men make Democrats nervous. It's also the reason, so on election night I was listening to NPR in a drive-in in Topeka. I was eating a hamburger and listening to NPR, and they were interviewing someone about a voter on the street in Kentucky, asking him who he voted for and why. And he said he dismissed the Democratic candidate as a spoiled rich kid. Okay? This is what always happens. It's always about social class. But Democrats can't see it that way. By the way, to choose Mitch McConnell on the grounds that he is a friend of the unrich, it's just like pushes all of these theories about low information voting right up to the breaking point. But I'm not going to go there right now. Now look, I have spent years poking holes in things that conservatives say. It's been a good career. I've had a lot of fun doing it. It's a lot of laughs, right? I mean, think about it. These guys, they blow off the facts when they feel like it. They swipe symbols from the other side. I mentioned Glenn Beck. They illustrate arguments on economics with fairy tales. Yes, they really do that. And the reasoning you hear on their favorite radio shows, I mean, when I tune in, it reminds me of something like from a brainwashing session at Lubyanka prison or something like that, right? I mean, it's preposterous, this movement. It is contemptible. But you know what it's better than? It's better than nothing. I want to go back one more time to the original cataclysms whose memories poison our every political moment, by which I mean the financial crisis and the Wall Street bailouts. And I want you to remember that the culprits of those cataclysms, by which I mean the bankers who wrecked the economy of the entire world, these people were not punished for what they did. They were rewarded. And when I say they were rewarded, I don't mean they got away with a slap on the wrist. I mean they were laden down with billions and our blessings. And today, those people are rich in a way that you and I will never be able to understand. And now all of this happened, remember, courtesy of our government, the officials of which have conducted themselves ever since as though nothing really improper happened at all. The bailout money has been recouped, they tell us. The experts understand these things, nothing to see here. Don't worry. Look, you could not have contrived a scenario better designed to destroy public faith in American institutions. I mean, seriously, what is the point of hard work, of scrapping for a few dollars more at some lousy hourly wage when dishonest financial legerdemain is so extremely profitable? Why should any of us play by the rules when they obviously don't apply to everyone? When louts and crooks and bullies take home society's greatest rewards. These bailouts created a perfect situation for populism in the old tradition of Andrew Jackson, for what we used to call here in Kansas calamity howlers, for Jeremiahs raging against the corrupt and the powerful. And one of our political parties in this country, as we've seen, took to this task immediately and with relish. And they tossed their old leaders overboard. You know, George W. Bush and his whole pack of cronies tossed them overboard, declared war on what they called the ruling class. They assembled with megaphones out in the park and gave voice to the people's outrage. But the other party, the other faction in our system, the actual political descendants of Andrew Jackson and William Jennings Bryan and Franklin Roosevelt, these people never really got it, failed to rise to the occasion. They didn't understand that the circumstances this time around called for something different than what they had done in the 1990s. They could not embrace the requirements of the moment, even though responding to hard times was once upon a time their party's very reason for being, right? Franklin Roosevelt, the Great Depression, this is why we have a Democratic Party. So why'd they fumble it so badly this time around? Well, the fashionable explanation, like I said, I live in Washington, D.C., or in the suburbs anyway, and the fashionable explanation among Barack Obama's pundit supporters is to say, well, you know, the president is powerless. You can't hold Barack Obama responsible for screwing all these things up, they say, because the country is drifting on this strong ideological current that he can do nothing about. You know, you've got these right-wing media moguls, Fox News. You've got this incorrigible South. Nothing you can do about that. I mean, nothing the president can do. And then there's the backwardness of the U.S. Senate, which is tilted to favor, places like Wyoming, which has fewer people than the District of Columbia. And each individual member has this enormous power. And then there's the gerrymandered districts that that choose our House of Representatives. And there's this perennial Washington problem of the revolving door, which makes good and effective regulation just impossible. So they say, look, Mr. Frank, there's these structural barriers. There's nothing Barack Obama can do. You can't expect him to have done anything about these problems. The presidency, they say, is inherently feeble. The real power is always somewhere else. It's out here, right? Out here in the hinterlands. It's always far away from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. It's always out there with the scheming state legislators who are, gerrymandering our House districts, or, the swaggering senators from states that have more cows than they do voters, right? It's the pundits themselves. All of them are able to hoodwink and trick our maximum executive leader. And that's what they say in D.C. But I'm here to tell you that is not good enough. And what I want to suggest, and this is kind of an unusual, I don't know of anybody else that, well, what the hell. So this is what my next book is about, okay? So now you're going to get the advance. Okay. What I want to suggest is that the reason Barack Obama did not act forcefully to press a populist economic agenda is the simplest reason of all. He didn't do it because he didn't want to do it. He didn't do the things that the Times called for because he didn't believe in doing those things. He didn't want to do them. That's the simplest explanation. And once you accept it as a possibility, everything starts falling into place. Let's go back one more time to the financial crisis and the bailouts. Like I said at the beginning, the preeminent issue of our time that we are going to look back at for the rest of our lives and say that's where it went, Not only did our Democratic administration in Washington leave Wall Street standing after Wall Street plunged the nation and the world into a slump without parallel, but our government allowed Wall Street to grow more concentrated and more powerful than they have ever been before. And our government made it plain that there are to be no consequences for Wall Street's misbehavior. The bonuses are always going to flow. The obvious fraudsters are never going to be prosecuted. That this one industry essentially stands above the law. And that is a fascinating thing. It's a horrifying thing to think about. But it's also obviously the case. To say that Obama fumbled this is to understate the matter pretty dramatically. The big question, of course, is why he fumbled it. And I want to review the record as it actually stands, not as his apologists like to say. And I want to point out three things. First of all, it was fully within Barack Obama's power to react to the financial crisis in a more aggressive and appropriate way than George Bush did. And when I say that it was within his power, I mean the laws were already in place. The laws were there. There's ample precedent. When Franklin Roosevelt ran his bailout program in the 1930s, he put banks out of business all over this country. If he didn't like their management, he fired them. Well, he didn't do it. His bailout guy did, his version of Tim Geithner. And speaking of Tim Geithner, Obama wasn't required to choose Tim Geithner to run the bailouts. He wasn't required to choose Eric Holder to run the Justice Department and never prosecute any bankers. He wasn't required to let Ben Bernanke have another term at the Federal Reserve, the man who completely dropped the ball on regulating these banks. All of this was within Barack Obama's power. He could have appointed a real attorney general. He could have appointed a Treasury secretary who got tough with these guys. All of this could have been done. What's crazy, and this is number two, it would have been really good policy if he had reacted in a more aggressive and appropriate way. And when I say it would have been good policy, what I mean is it would have been good for America. The economy would have recovered a lot more quickly if we hadn't had to work for years to bail out Wall Street banks. The economy would have recovered more quickly, and the danger, more importantly, the danger of a future crisis brought on by concentrated financial power would have been reduced. These people are still out there. What's going to happen when they do it again, And third of all, and this is the one that really gets me, it would have been massively popular if Obama had reacted to the financial crisis in a more aggressive and appropriate way. This is what everybody was demanding that he do. This is what everyone thought he was going to do. This is why he had 60,000 people come out in Kansas City to hear him speak. He was the second coming of Franklin Roosevelt. He was on the cover. Was it Time magazine that put him on the cover with Roosevelt's cigarette holder and the fedora? This is what he was elected to do. It would have been enormously popular, and even his own people admit this. If you read Tim Geithner's memoirs of the bailout days, Geithner thinks of himself as a very noble person because he resisted the public's, mindless baying for banker blood, right? That's what makes him such an awesome Treasury Secretary. Acting aggressively, had Obama acted aggressively, might also have deflated the whole Tea Party movement. All of this kind of rampant false consciousness that's going on, like Paul Ryan writing an article called Down with Big Business. None of that would have been possible. Glenn Beck, all of that. It would have been a big joke had Obama showed us the right way to go on this. It would have prevented the entire electoral disaster that's since befallen his party in Congress. But he didn't do that. He did the opposite. Obama did the opposite. He did everything he could to foam the runways. Remember this phrase? This is Tim Geithner's phrase. To foam. You need to look it up, okay? Or you can ask me about it when we're done. To foam the runways for the banks. He never showed any real interest in taking these guys on. I mean, you think of let's just go down the list of things he could have done. The Bush administration bailouts that he could have unwound. Or even, just called into question, done a more thorough investigation of. Think of the bad regulators that he didn't fire. I mean, the bank regulators in this country are what we call captured. And he did almost nothing about this. The AIG bonuses. His guys went on TV and defended those. Do you remember that? Cram down, which he never pushed for. Cram down would have been the middle class bailout, the bailout for people who are getting foreclosed upon. Obama's like, whatever. The receivership, putting the zombie banks into receivership, which he never pushed for. His own people were telling him he should do it with Citibank. He didn't do it. The FBI agents said he never shifted over to white-collar crime, right? They're all still out there investigating terrorism that never happens. The executives of the bailed-out banks that he never fired. The standing outrage of too-big-to-fail institutions. We still have banks in this country that they say are too big to fail. They still exist. He never, it was never properly addressed. You have Dodd-Frank now, but it's weak. You think of the top bankers that were never prosecuted for anything on this long, long list of obvious frauds that they and their people committed. Liar loans, for God's sakes. I mean, it's fraud on the face of it. Obama didn't play this greatest of all issues the way he did because the white working class rose up to defend its friends on Wall Street. That's not why he did it. He didn't play it this way because making the Republicans defend Wall Street would have been really bad politics. He didn't do that. And he didn't do it the way he did because the presidency lacks sufficient power. The president is actually a very powerful official in our system. Everything I just mentioned a few minutes ago, everything on that list were things that can be done by the president, according to the bank regulator Bill Black, who's now at UMKC in Kansas City. He says it just requires some will, some imagination, and a little bit of planning and determination. Everything I just said could have been done by Obama. Now the conservatives understood this. They got what was going on, as their many movements and ideas and manifestos showed us. And the country demanded an expression of outrage, and the conservative movement provided it, furnished it. Conservatives claimed to speak for a recession-battered people, and they, as I showed you, they adopted the tones and the markings, and they pretended to be a hard-time social uprising, just like we saw in Kansas so many times back in our grandparents' age. But the Democrats, man, so like I say, I live in Washington around these people, and when I watch the Washington Democrats in action, my mind goes back to the tragically incompetent generals of World War I. You know what I'm talking about? Ordering up assault after gigantic assault, only to see their armies annihilated, one after another. But still, they kept right at it, right? Ordering up another round of the exact same goddamn thing. Always attacking right down the middle, right? You got to play fair, play by the gentlemanly rules of combat, never doing anything remotely clever, and then always completely surprised when the other side would introduce them to 20th century warfare in some, brutal new way. Sometimes I wonder what this country is going to look like if our new revitalized right ever finally does get a chance to do exactly what they say they want to do with our country. And maybe when that day finally comes, what the pundits have been saying all these years will finally come to pass. The rightward drift will somehow reverse itself, all on its own. The rightward drift that's been going on since I was a sophomore in high school will finally stop and the nation will change course, all by itself. Or maybe, as Americans clamber further down into the sulfurous pit we call utopia, the thinking of our market-minded friends will continue to evolve. And before long, they will discover that certain once uncontroversial arms of the state must be amputated immediately. What are interstate highways and national parks, they will ask, but wasteful subsidies for leeches who ought to be paying their own way? What is disaster relief but a power grab by the losers who can't get themselves out of the path of a hurricane? Social Security will have to go, of course, as the essential injustice of protecting the weak dawns on them. I mean, why should society pay for the retirement of someone who hasn't been responsible and collected Krugerrands like everyone knows you're supposed to do? Every problem that the editorialists fret about today will get worse, of course. Inequality, global warming, financial bubbles, one after another, but it won't matter. On our country will go, chasing the only ideology that we have left, down into the seething Arcadia of all against all. Thank you very much. Hey, look, I'm wearing purple socks. You see? Oh, yeah, so what they want you to do is to come up to these microphones here to ask the questions. If you've got questions. If you don't, that's fine, too, because I understand there are places where I can get 3-2 beer around here. Is that right? Do they?
I have a simple question.
Okay.
Do you see any hope?
Okay, next question. Look, I've been wrestling a lot with that. So I've just finished writing the first draft of this new book about the Democrats and the failure that I'm describing. Not just the failure with the bailouts and the financial crisis, but a broader failure, over the last, since the 80s. And I keep thinking, Jesus, Frank, where's your hope? You've got to have something here. And I have always had trouble, all my life I've had trouble summoning hope, and I have some friends that, I don't know. Look, I live in D.C. How can I have hope? Well, it's, John Boehner's going to make an excellent lobbyist. There, that's, he'll get to have a really nice McMansion in Potomac, Maryland or something. I don't know. What do I hope? What drives me absolutely. Look, we all know what the solution is. We all know what the answer is. I mean, if you think about it for very long, we know what the solution is and we know what the answer is. We know what's wrong with the Democrats. And we also know how it can be fixed. But we don't like to talk about it. Every left party in the world is a party of the working class. Our Democrats are not. I mean, yes, they still take the unions' money and they go to their conventions and they, and they speak in union halls and they do all that sort of thing. But they are, when you listen to Democratic strategists talk in Washington, D.C., go and look on the Washington Post, their constituents do not include the working class. Their constituents include minorities, women, young people, and the professional managerial class. That's the class that when they slice people this way, they slice people that way. But when they slice people by class, by social class, the one they're interested in is not workers. Okay, that distinguishes our Democrats from basically every other left party in the world. That's what's wrong with these guys. How do you fix that? Oh my God. I don't know, because it's a difficult situation. I spend a lot of time with labor guys, and if you ever want to, you think I'm a downer, you think I'm negative. Oh my God, these guys are like, we're beaten, we can't win this, we can't organize anymore. They've got us. They've got the law is against us. If we do anything, we'll get sued, and blah 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 blah. It's really really depressing, but the thing is that it could take off. You are in a moment right now where workers are very, very angry. And whether they're voting for Republicans or whether they're voting for Democrats, they're pissed off. And once upon a time in this country, when you had that sort of situation, you also had a remedy. And that remedy was you joined a union. You started a union in your workplace. It's hard to do that now because, like those guys say, the law is against you. But that was the answer. If you were to see that happen again, and if you were to see a mass movement form in this country, you would have, again, a chance for a proper liberal party, like you had with Franklin Roosevelt, like you had with Harry Truman, like you had in the 1890s. By the way, this is not some pipe dream. The way I got started on all this stuff was by studying populism in Kansas. You guys probably don't know this. I'm a lot older than you. This state was once not just progressive, it was radical. It was out of control. The title of my book that we were talking about earlier, What's the Matter with Kansas, I didn't come up with that. It's taken from an editorial from 1896 in the Emporia Gazette. The author of the editorial, when he said, "What's the matter with Kansas?" he's like, "Why is this state so goddamn left-wing crazy? Why do they keep voting for these, shiftless ne'er-do-well, farmers for high office? What the hell is wrong with them?" That's what he was asking when he said, "What's the matter with Kansas?" And this is a tradition that goes way back in our history of workers and farmers and other groups organizing themselves into a movement and getting results. And I don't just mean in terms of politics, but in terms of their individual lives. And when that happens, then the Democratic Party will follow along. The problem is I don't know when that's going to happen. I've been waiting for that all my life. So, we all thought it was going to happen when Reagan was president. And, yeah.
Well, I thought I would buck my usual pessimism and say there is a little bit of hope, because even though the Democrats don't give us much of a reason to vote for them, the Republicans seem to be trying awful hard to make sure that the playing field has to be tilted unfairly.
Oh, yeah, you're right. You're
toward
right.
them.
I always overlook the obvious answer. You're exactly right.
So,
yeah.
like in Kansas right now, there's going to be a lawsuit over the voting machines and the tallies that in the last election, possibly. And they have to do a lot of things in order to keep people's low information. They have to work hard to keep the information from that people. And then once they have the information, they have to work hard to keep them from voting. So there is some hope. I just wanted to.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, look, the Republicans are self-destructing as fast as they can. It's just a spectacle. And and they don't address the problems, and the problems get worse, and people get madder, and but you can't have a system like that. It can't just be you've got one party that's like in this world of their own, and then the other that is all worried about doing everything with the experts and all. It's no good. I mean, it will fix itself eventually, I suppose. Wait, while you were speaking, I thought of something else to be hopeful about. God, what the hell was it? Yeah, I've lost it. I'm sorry, but there is that. So if in D.C., by the way, most mainstream Democrats are not hopeless and unhappy like me. They are very confident. They're quite certain that the Republicans are going to self-destruct. They're pissing off all these different groups. They've pushed too far in this issue. I remember, God, when I was writing What's the Matter with Kansas, I met I won't say who it was, a high-ranking Clinton administration official, and I was telling him what I was working on. And this is... what year would this have been? About 2002. And he said, oh, yeah, they've pushed too far there. It's going to go back the other way. Democrats are going to sweep there because the right wing has gone too far in Kansas in 2002. That was pretty funny. But they always count on this. This is what they do. They sit around in D.C., these pundits, and they look at the numbers, and they look at the demographic changes that are happening in the country, and they're like, we've got this group, we've got this group, we've got this group. We got this thing in the bag. Yeah, Republicans can win some elections here and there for the next 10 years, maybe even the next 20 years, but after that they're doomed. And it's like they might change what they're saying. Republicans might change what they say. They might adapt. It's very possible. All sorts of things. If you just sit, like the Democrats do, if you just sit and wait for history to deliver victory to you, that is a recipe for disaster. But that is the recipe. That's their strategy in D.C. It's just, I'll shut up after this, but there's this article in the Washington Post about, to understand D.C., you really have to read the Washington Post every day. It's really an extraordinary piece of work. But there's an article about West Virginia going Republican. West Virginia has, when I was growing up, there was no more Democratic state. This is the most blue-collar state. This is a place that elected Democrats as a matter of course. And now it's at the national, all its national level representatives, almost all of them now, are Republicans, and not just any old Republican. It's the same thing as Kansas. It's, they're out there like that. And the Washington Post had a story about this. And the question was, well, what can Democrats do about the Appalachian voters slipping away from them? And the answer was, well, nothing. A, nothing. B, they can wait 20 years, and then maybe the demographics of the state will have changed, and then Democrats can win again. That's their answer. It's like, that's it? That's what you have? That's what our modern Democratic Party has to offer some of the poorest people in America? Like, wait 20 years? But that's how they think. That's how this bunch thinks. They are really fascinating. Yeah.
What is your perspective on the grassroots support for the Bernie Sanders campaign, and how does his candidacy fit into your perspective on the Democratic Party at present?
Well, Bernie Sanders. So I interviewed Bernie Sanders last year for Salon.com. It was a good interview. You should look it up. It was he was. What's funny is he agreed with. Well, we agree with each other on everything. It's kind of a problem. But he said in the interview, I think he said this. I could be confusing it with something else, but I believe I asked him how he could, a candidate for president with his politics could hope to win, because it's all about money. Money obviously doesn't really approve of Bernie Sanders. And, how could a man like him possibly hope to win? And he said, there's another way. There's another way to do this. And that is, obviously what he's doing now, which is these sort of mass, grassroots appeal. By the way, This is an interesting fact. Maybe you don't know this. When I was young in the 60s, and before that, going back to the 50s, the 40s, the 30s, Democrats never had any money. The Republicans always outspent them, and outspent them massively. William Jennings Bryan was outspent by, on the record, the official record is 10 to 1, but it was probably more like 20 to 1. This always happened back in the old days. And that didn't deter them. They still tried, and they often won. You look at Franklin Roosevelt, he won 4 times. You know, you think of Harry Truman beating Tom Dewey. You think of all of these, you know, the entire history of the Democratic Party was, or in the 20th century, was they were the ones without any money. And now, though, they don't think about it that way. You know, Barack Obama was the first Democrat to outraise his Republican opponent. And not just outraise him. He did outraise John McCain, but he outraised him specifically on Wall Street, which is an amazing thing if you think about it. Wall Street had always been, before that, a fairly reliable Republican constituency. And then all of a sudden they go for Barack Obama. That's amazing. But then you look at how the Democrats like Obama campaign now. In 2008, yes, he was this great man of the people going around the country doing these wonderful speeches. In 2012, it was all big data. It was all computerized, and then TV commercials. You know, some very good TV commercials, but it was all money. It was all done with money. Yeah.
The Occupy Wall Street movement kind of represented that public outrage you're talking about, but never went anywhere.
Yeah.
Do you blame it on its own lack of leadership, or do you blame it on media pressures, or what?
So I wrote about Occupy Wall Street. I was obviously pretty fascinated by them when it happened, and I was very disappointed when it all fell apart. And you know, when the police threw them all in jail and blah 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 blah. But you could also see it coming. These were guys without a real. They didn't really have, well, you know, they didn't have leaders, of course, and they didn't really have any organizational structure. And I think that both of those things, they still could have had an impact if they had, and this is going to sound, you've heard this critique before, but had they had a list of demands, and they were against doing that. They finally, towards the very end, decided they were going to come up with one, and then they never got around to it. You know, because the organization of it was so poor, you know, the organization. But the reason for a list of demands, it's not just some logocentric thing that you do in order to, you know, it's not going to corporatize you or something to have a list of demands. I think of the populist movement in the 1890s, and they had a list of demands. And the great thing about that list of demands was that they could go to any candidate, whether the movement was alive or dead, and where do you stand on these issues? And the candidate would have to answer that. And everybody was familiar with what their demands were, with what their platform said. It was well known. And, you know, it would have shaped the debate. It would have shaped the political debate that's happened. As things stand, Occupy is gone without a trace and has left us basically nothing. I mean, you remember when they used to compare them to the Tea Party movement? The Tea Party movement has a caucus in Congress of, what, dozens of members? Maybe 100 members? The Occupy caucus doesn't exist. Yeah.
Eisenhower cautioned us about the military-industrial complex. Do you see this as a current problem or not?
Well, yeah. Absolutely, yeah. But it's a problem, but it's less of a problem now than it was 10 years ago. So when Bush was president, I remember when Bush got elected, and I said to myself, I should go out and buy defense stocks. And then I was like, no, he would never be that crass. He wouldn't just go out and declare war on somebody. He did. And
well, with the lion's share of our national budget in defense, isn't this a little awkward?
Awkward? Well, what do you? Yeah. Well, yeah. But it's on the back burner in my mind these days because I think we have, you know, different problems right now. But so I live in D.C. and I wrote this book about Washington called The Wrecking Crew. And part of it was about the incredible presence of the military-industrial complex in Washington. And I mean, it's everywhere. It's especially in Virginia, because the Pentagon is in Virginia. But you drive around, and I would look up Like, for example, where are the General Dynamics offices in Washington? Well, they have 8 different ones. So I went around to these offices. And some of them are just plain old office buildings, but some of them were so unbelievably swanky. I went into one just by mistake. So I drive to I think it was General Dynamics. It might have been Boeing. It might have been Lockheed. I don't know. I drove up to it, and I'm pulling up in my car, and a guy comes up to my car and says, valet parking. And I'm like, what? What? And so I was like, I want the full experience. I'm like, yeah, okay. And he drives off in my car. And I go inside, and there's this restaurant. It's like a 5-star restaurant. It's got a gigantic 19th century painting on the wall. They've got, like 20-year-old brandies or whatever they're called, cognacs on a cart that they wheel around. It's unbelievable. They had a Dali, the artist Dali. They had something by Salvador Dali in there. This is in the General Dynamics building. It's just unbelievably sumptuous. And so Washington right now is the richest city in America. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the Beltway area is the richest metro area in the United States. It passed San Francisco after the housing meltdown because we didn't really have that in Washington. But the reason that it's so incredibly rich is not because they pay federal workers these princely amounts. It's because of lobbyists and defense contractors. Defense contractors, these guys. So anyhow, I wrote a whole book about this stuff and about all of the kind of, the way that they rip off the Defense Department and the stuff that was going on in Iraq. Like they brought pallets of $100 bills, shrink-wrapped $100 bills over there and lost them. Yeah. They did stuff like that. It was like the stuff that went, it was like, I started to think that Iraq was just like where they're going to make the handoff. The business is in Virginia, and then the president is across the river in the District of Columbia, but they make the handoff over in Iraq. That's why we invaded it, so they could go over there and give them the pallet of shrink-wrapped cash, It's insane living there, and these people are in a planet of their own. Over in Virginia, these not McMansions, these are like Versailles, this is like Trump-style living, the way these people go through life. It'll blow your mind. Yeah, you should come out and see it sometime. By the way, okay, I'm going to shut up now. We're going to go drink 3-2 beer. Okay, a couple more questions, but we made a video for this book, The Wrecking Crew. It was the style then was to make a video for your book, and in the video, I drive this cameraman around the defense contractors and the wealthy neighborhoods of Washington, D.C. You should check it out. It's pretty funny. It's on the internet somewhere. Yeah.
Last question.
Okay.
So when we talk about the differences between the crisis in the 1930s in comparison to 2008, there's something uniquely global about the situation, and how much of the ways in which the powerful stake makers are beholden to kind of global powers now in comparison to those earlier moments will factor into how we can fight that in our location in the U.S. There's a question there.
Okay. How they get, because it's a global crisis?
Absolutely.
Well, see, this is, by the way, this is another kind of hopeful moment. Obama, for all his, I've been very critical of him in the way that he responded to the crisis. He responded a lot better than the Europeans did. They really loused it up. They are still, look at Greece. Look at Spain. These people are still just absolutely scraping along the bottom. And I don't know how they're ever going to pull themselves out of it. It just looks awful for them because they, of course, as Paul Krugman reminds us again and again and again, these people embraced austerity in a way that Obama did too, but only after it was later on. And also in America, we have control of our economic policy apparatus in a way that they do not. Like the Federal Reserve, the dollar, all of these sort of different implements that we have, these the tools to control the economy here that they don't have in Europe, and they basically, they're screwed. And the ironic thing is it didn't even start over there; it started over here, and people buying flipping houses in Las Vegas or wherever, Orange County or something like that. And now those people in Spain are all unemployed to this day. But you wanted something more hopeful than that, I think.
Well, I guess the question is that, to some extent we can do things within our space in our country, but the ways in which power is related to kind of global corporate power now.
Yeah.
There's limits.
There's limits to what we can do, yeah, and that gets worse. I mean, the trade deals, and I don't want to call them free trade deals because that's not really what they are. These are deals designed to protect the property of corporations wherever they do business. Like when you all remember NAFTA? You all old enough to remember NAFTA? So the big debate at the time of NAFTA was, who could be against trade? That's what they'd always say. How could anyone be stupid enough to oppose trade? NAFTA wasn't about trade. NAFTA was about securing property rights for American companies that want to do business in Mexico. And so is this current the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's what it's about. Specifically, intellectual property rights. You know what that means? It doesn't mean like my copyright to What's the Matter with Kansas. It means prescription drugs. Okay, so that our companies can charge those sort of insane prices anywhere they do business. So that like a country like Singapore, although I don't think Singapore would ever do this, or the Philippines or something, can't take some medicine and make a generic copy of it and sell it for pennies. No, you have to pay $3,000 a pill, and that's very alarming. But I think at the end of the day, if the American public really well and truly got mad, there's nowhere that these people could go that's going to give them shelter from the anger of the American public. If we really meant it, I don't think that. I think that the U.S. is still the economically, anyways, the country that matters more than any other. It'd be pretty funny if all the multinationals moved to China. That would be hilarious, and then you could all throw tomatoes at me for leading you down the garden path. You said it would work out, Frank! But I still think that we can do whatever we want in this country, economically speaking, and I don't think that they can do it. I don't think they can stop us. They talk big, and they're like, if you regulate the banks, we're going to move to London. Let's see you try it. I'd love to see that happen. Anyhow. I'm sorry, it's not my great forte, this subject, but thank you so much for coming out. It's really great being here again.